September 2019, three hikers were exploring a remote section of Montana's Flathead National Forest when they stumbled upon something that shouldn't exist. Rising above the dense pine trees, half hidden by decades of overgrowth, stood a fire lookout tower that didn't appear on any modern maps. The wooden structure was weathered gray, listing slightly to one side, its windows dark and empty like the eyes of a skull. They almost walked past it. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and what they found on the top floor of that forgotten tower would solve a mystery that had haunted a small Montana town for 62 years. If mysteries that span generations fascinate you, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happened to David Miller on October 15, 1957 will challenge everything you think you know about how people disappear. This is the story of an experienced hunter who walked into the forest one autumn morning and never came back. This is the story of a family that lived with uncertainty for decades. And this is the story of a discovery that would finally bring answers, but raise even more haunting questions about survival, desperation, and the unforgiving nature of the wilderness. David Miller was 34 years old in the fall of 1957. A man built by hard work and hardened by war. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall with broad shoulders and the kind of lean, muscular build that comes from years of physical labor outdoors. His hair was dark brown, cut military short, even though he'd been out of the army for 12 years. His face was weathered from sun and wind, with deep-set blue eyes that could read terrain like other men read books. He had served in World War II from 1943 to 1945, spending 2 years in the European theater as part of the 1st Infantry Division. He had landed at Omaha Beach on D-Day, fought through France and Belgium, and was present at the end of the war and the liberation of concentration camps in Germany. He didn't talk much about the war, but those who knew him said it had changed him, made him quieter, more careful, more aware of how quickly conditions could turn deadly. In 1957, David worked as a forest ranger for the U.S. Forest Service in northwestern Montana, based out of the small town of Cascade, population barely 800. His job involved maintaining trails, monitoring wildlife, checking permits during hunting season, and occasionally manning one of the fire lookout towers scattered throughout the Flathead National Forest. He knew these mountains better than almost anyone alive. He had walked every major trail, climbed to most of the lookout towers, and could navigate by landmarks even in heavy fog. But David was more than just a ranger. He was a hunter, as his father and grandfather had been before him. Hunting wasn't sport to David Miller. It was tradition, sustenance, a way of connecting with the land and providing for his family. Every fall, when the aspen leaves turned gold and the first cold snaps warned of winter approaching, David would take a few days to hunt deer or elk in the high country. He was meticulous in his preparation, always checking his gear twice, always filing his route plan with Helen, always carrying emergency supplies. Helen Miller was 32, a slender woman with kind brown eyes and auburn hair that she wore pinned back in a practical style. She had married David in TV 1948, 3 years after he returned from the war. They had built a small but comfortable life in Cascade. David worked for the Forest Service. Helen taught 2nd grade at the local elementary school. Together they were raising 2 children, Tommy, 8 years old, with his father's dark hair and serious demeanor, and Lisa, 5, a bright, energetic girl who adored her father absolutely. The Miller house sat on Pine Street, a modest 2-bedroom with a workshop in the garage where David maintained his hunting equipment and tools. Neighbors described them as a solid family, the kind of people who showed up when someone needed help, who attended church on Sundays, who were raising their children right. David coached Little League baseball in the summer. Helen organized the school's Christmas pageant every year. They were woven into the fabric of their community in a way that made what happened next all the more devastating. October 15, 1957 was a Tuesday. David had been planning this hunt for weeks, waiting for the weather to align with his days off. The forecast called for clear skies, temperatures in the low 40s during the day, dropping to the 20s at night. Perfect conditions. The deer would be moving, preparing for winter, and the crisp air would make tracking easier. David woke at 4:30 in the morning, as he always did on hunting mornings. Helen heard him moving quietly through the house, making coffee, gathering the lunch she had prepared the night before. He dressed in layers: thermal underwear, wool shirt, heavy canvas hunting jacket in brown and tan camouflage pattern, wool pants, thick socks, and well-worn leather boots that he'd waterproofed the previous evening. At 6:15 in the morning, he carried his gear to the truck: his Winchester Model 70 rifle in .30-06 caliber, a gun he'd owned since 1950 and knew intimately, a hunting knife in a leather sheath on his belt, a compass, matches in a waterproof container, a first aid kit, water canteen, rope, a small tarp, everything a careful man brings into the mountains. Helen came to the kitchen doorway as he was preparing to leave. "You have everything?" she asked, the same question she asked every time. "Everything?" David confirmed. He kissed her forehead. "Should be back by 6 tonight, 7 at the latest if the hunting's good. Be careful up there." "Always am." He smiled at her, the quiet smile she had fallen in love with. "Tell the kids I'll bring back something for dinner." Those were the last words Helen Miller ever heard her husband speak. David's plan, which he had outlined to Helen the night before, was straightforward. He would drive north on Highway 89 for about 40 miles, then take Forest Road 486 east into the Flathead National Forest. His destination was an area he knew well, about 8 miles up the mountain, where a series of meadows bordered dense pine forest. Deer frequently moved through that area in autumn, traveling between feeding grounds. He planned to park at the trailhead, hike in about 2 miles to a ridge he'd scouted earlier that month, and spend the day hunting from that vantage point. The drive would take about 90 minutes. He'd be on location by 7:30 in the morning, perfect timing. At 6:15 in the morning, David stopped for gas at Morrison's service station on the edge of Cascade. Earl Morrison, the owner, saw him and waved. They exchanged a few words about the weather, about the hunting prospects. Earl would later tell investigators that David seemed completely normal, relaxed, confident, looking forward to the day ahead. He filled his truck's tank, bought a Coke and a candy bar for later, and drove north into the pre-dawn darkness. That was the last confirmed sighting of David Miller alive. 6 o'clock that evening came and went with no sign of David's truck pulling into the driveway. Helen wasn't immediately worried. Hunting sometimes went long. Maybe he'd gotten an elk and needed extra time to field dress it and pack it out. Maybe he'd seen something worth tracking and lost track of time. David was experienced. He knew what he was doing. By 7:30 in the evening, with full darkness settling over Cascade and the temperature dropping, Helen's concern deepened. David said 7 at the latest. He was never late without reason. At 9 o'clock in the evening, Helen called the sheriff's office. Sheriff Tom Bradley had known David for years. "He's probably fine, Helen," Bradley said, but his voice carried an edge of concern. "Probably had truck trouble or something, but I'll send a deputy up that way first thing in the morning to check." But morning was hours away, and Helen Miller spent that night sitting in her living room, watching the window, listening for the sound of David's truck. The house was too quiet. Tommy and Lisa were asleep, unaware that anything was wrong. Helen sat alone, praying to hear her husband's footsteps on the porch, knowing with each passing hour that something terrible had happened. October 20th, 1957, dawned cold and gray. Sheriff Bradley and 2 deputies drove north on Highway 89 at first light, following the route David Miller would have taken. At Forest Road 486, they turned east and began climbing into the mountains. The narrow dirt road wound through dense forest, climbing steadily. 8 miles in, they found David's truck. The 1955 Ford F-100, dark green with the Forest Service emblem still visible on the door, sat alone at the trailhead parking area. The truck was locked. There was no sign of damage, no flat tires, nothing to suggest mechanical trouble. Through the windows, they could see David's hunting pack on the passenger seat, his water canteen, and his lunchbox, but his rifle was gone, as were the clothes he would have been wearing. Sheriff Bradley tried the doors, locked. He peered through the windows, documenting everything he saw. He went hunting, Bradley said to his deputies, took his rifle, left everything else, planned to come back.
They called out David's name, their voices echoing through the silent forest. No response. They fired 3 shots into the air, the universal signal for someone lost to respond. The shots cracked through the cold morning, echoing off the mountain slopes. Then, silence. The deputies hiked the main trail for 2 miles, calling David's name every few hundred yards, watching for any sign of him. Nothing. No footprints in the soft earth, no disturbed vegetation, no blood trails from a wounded deer, no sign that David Miller ever had been in that area at all. It was as if he had evaporated the moment he left his truck. By afternoon, word had spread through Cascade. David Miller was missing. For a community of 800 people, this wasn't just news, this was personal. David was their forest ranger, their neighbor, their friend, and the mountains he had.
Articles of David's clothing to establish scent. They circled the truck, noses to the ground, then headed up the main trail. But after a quarter mile, they lost the scent completely. The handlers tried multiple times, starting from different points around the parking area. The dogs would follow the trail briefly, then stop, confused, unable to pick up any continuing scent. "It's like he just stopped existing right here," one handler said, frustrated. "Dogs are good. They should be able to track him." Theories emerged quickly. The most popular was that David had encountered a grizzly bear. The Flathead National Forest was home to a healthy grizzly population, and autumn was when they were most aggressive, desperately feeding before hibernation. Perhaps David had surprised a bear. Perhaps he'd been killed quickly, his body carried away. It would explain why the dogs couldn't track him, why there were no signs of struggle at the trailhead. But experienced hunters in the search party shook their heads. David knew bear safety, one said. He carried bear spray, made noise when he walked. He wouldn't have been surprised. And even if a bear attacked, there'd be signs, blood, torn clothing, rifle shots if he tried to defend himself. There's nothing. Another theory suggested David had suffered a medical emergency, heart attack, stroke, some sudden incapacitating event. He could have collapsed off-trail, hidden by dense underbrush. But David was 34, in excellent physical condition, with no history of heart problems. And why would he have left the trail before even beginning his hunt? A darker whisper circulated, though few spoke it aloud. Suicide. David was a World War II veteran. Everyone knew the war had changed him. Maybe the darkness had caught up with him? Maybe he'd driven up there deliberately, walked deep into the forest But Helen rejected this vehemently. David would never, she said, her voice shaking with anger and grief. He had everything to live for, his children, me, his work. He was happy. He was planning Tommy's birthday party for next month. People who are planning birthday parties don't kill themselves. The search continued for 3 weeks. Volunteers scoured over 40 square miles of wilderness. They checked every trail, every ridgeline, every valley within reasonable hiking distance of the trailhead. They investigated every drainage, every cliff edge, every place a person could fall or become trapped. They found nothing. By early November, snow began falling in the high country. Heavy, wet snow that buried the ground beneath inches, then feet of white. The search became impossible. Trails disappeared. Visibility dropped. The risk of searchers themselves becoming lost or injured grew too high. On November 8, 1957, Sheriff Bradley made the call. "We have to suspend," he told the assembled volunteers, his voice heavy. "The snow is too deep. We've covered every reasonable area. I don't know where else to look." Helen Miller sat in his office, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You're giving up on him." "We're not giving up, Helen. We're stopping for winter. When the snow melts in spring, we'll search again. He could be out there right now, injured, waiting for help." Bradley's face was grim. "Helen, it's been 3 weeks. The temperatures have been below freezing at night. If David was injured and immobile," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to.
The spring thaw came in April 1958. True to his word, Sheriff Bradley organized another search. Smaller this time, maybe 20 volunteers instead of 50, but thorough. They hiked the same areas again, looking for what the melting snow might reveal. They found nothing. Over the following years, the occasional hiker or hunter would report finding something, thinking perhaps it was related to David Miller. A torn piece of fabric, rusted metal, bone fragments that turned out to be deer or elk. Each report was investigated. None led anywhere. David Miller's case went cold. The file remained open, but with no leads, no evidence, no body, there was nothing more to investigate. Legally, David was declared deceased in 1964, 7 years after his disappearance, so Helen could receive his Forest Service benefits and begin to move forward with her life. But she never accepted that he was gone. For the rest of her life, Helen maintained that somewhere in those mountains, David was waiting to be found, waiting to come home. The impact on the Miller family was profound and permanent. Tommy, who had been 8 when his father disappeared, grew up angry. Angry at the forest that took his father, angry at the searchers who couldn't find him, angry at a world where people could just vanish. He left Cascade at 18 and never returned, settling in Seattle, becoming an engineer, building a life as far from those mountains as he could get. Lisa, only 5 when her father disappeared, had fewer memories, but felt the loss just as deeply. She remembered a tall man who smelled like pine trees and gun oil, who would lift her onto his shoulders and carry her around the yard. She remembered his laugh, though over time even that memory faded. She stayed closer to home, eventually becoming a teacher like her mother, marrying a local man, raising children in the same small-town Montana environment she'd grown up in. Helen never remarried. She kept David's clothes in the closet, his coffee mug on the shelf, his boots by the back door. Once a year, on October 15th, the anniversary of his disappearance, she would drive up Highway 89 to the trailhead where his truck had been found. She would sit there for an hour, sometimes longer, looking into those silent mountains, asking questions that had no answers. In Cascade, David Miller became something of a local legend, the forest ranger who walked into the woods and never came back. Parents used him as a cautionary tale. Even experienced people can get lost. Even people who know what they're doing can run into trouble. Respect the wilderness. But the truth was, nobody knew what had happened to David Miller. And as years turned into decades, as the 1960s gave way to the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, as technology advanced and satellite phones and GPS made the wilderness less deadly, David's disappearance seemed destined to remain an eternal mystery.
Falling trees. But about 10 feet up, the stairs seemed more intact. "We could probably climb up there," Jake said. The statement half challenge, half question. "That's a terrible idea," Amy countered. "This thing's a death trap." "Come on, when are we ever going to find something like this again? We'll be careful." Against Amy's better judgment, they decided to investigate. Jake, who was the tallest and had rock climbing experience, boosted himself up to the first intact stair. He tested it carefully. It held. He climbed slowly, testing each step before putting his full weight on it. The structure groaned and creaked, but held. "I'm going to the top," he called down. "It's stable enough if you're careful." Marcus followed, then reluctantly. Amy. They climbed slowly, hearing the wood protest beneath their feet, feeling the entire tower sway slightly in the wind. At the top, a small platform surrounded the cabin. The door hung on one hinge, partially open. Jake pushed it wider and stepped inside. Immediately, he stopped. "Oh, God. What?" Marcus moved up behind him, then froze. Jesus Christ. The cabin was small, perhaps 10 feet by 12 feet. Windows on all 4 walls, most of the glass long gone or cracked into spider webs. A simple wooden table, now warped and weathered, a chair tipped on its side, And in the corner, slumped against the wall beneath the eastern window, were human remains. The body was partially mummified, preserved by the dry conditions inside the cabin. Leather hunting boots still laced, tattered canvas pants, the remnants of a brown and tan camouflage jacket, skeletal hands, one still clutching what appeared to be a small notebook, and propped against the wall beside the body, a rifle covered in rust, but unmistakably a rifle. The skull was tilted back, jaw open, facing the window, as if whoever this had been had died looking out at the forest one last time. Amy, despite being a medical professional who had seen death before, backed out of the cabin immediately. Her hands were shaking. "We need to call the police right now." But they were 6 miles into the wilderness with no cell service. Jake took photographs with his phone, documenting everything, but careful not to touch anything. They marked the location on their GPS, then they descended carefully, hiked back to the trailhead as quickly as they could, and drove until they got cell signal. At 6:47 in the evening on September 12, 2019, the Flathead County Sheriff's Office received a call reporting human remains discovered in an abandoned fire tower deep in the National Forest. The recovery operation took 2 days to organize. The location was remote, accessible only by hiking, and the tower itself was structurally unsound. A team of forensic investigators, Forest Service rangers, and a structural engineer made the trek on September 14th. The engineer examined the tower and declared it too dangerous to support the weight of multiple people. They would have to collapse it in a controlled manner after removing the remains. But first, everything needed to be documented in place. Investigators photographed the scene meticulously from every angle: the body's position, the rifle, the scattered equipment. Near the body, they found several items that had survived decay: a leather wallet, a compass, a hunting knife in its sheath, and a small waterproof container with matches inside. The wallet was the breakthrough. Inside, protected by the leather, was a Montana driver's license. The photo faded but visible, the name still legible: David A. Miller. Address: 412 Pine Street, Cascade, Montana. Date of birth: March 8, 1923. Issue date: January 1956. The lead investigator, Detective Sarah Johnson, felt a chill run down her spine. "David Miller," she said aloud. "That name sounds familiar." An older Forest Service ranger, Tom Blackwell, who had worked in the area for 30 years, suddenly went pale. "David Miller? Jesus. The ranger who disappeared in '57. I've heard the old-timers talk about him. He went hunting and never came back. They searched for weeks." "That was 62 years ago," Johnson said, processing the timeline. 62 years. "And he was up here the whole time," Blackwell said, looking around the cabin. 3 miles from where they were searching. Nobody thought to check the tower. The rifle was a Winchester Model 70, exactly what David had been carrying. The notebook, clutched in his skeletal hand, was too deteriorated to read. The pages stuck together, but forensic specialists hoped they might be able to preserve and examine it later. But the most haunting detail was the body's position. David was sitting upright, back against the wall, facing the window that overlooked the valley to the south, the window that would have provided a view of the area where searchers had been looking for him. He had died watching them search, unable to signal, unable to get down, unable to save himself. On the floor near the body, investigators found scratches in the wood, messages carved with a knife or bullet casing. Most were illegible, worn smooth by decades, but one was still clear: October 17, 4 days after he'd gone missing. The remains were carefully removed and transported to the state medical examiner's office in Missoula. The tower was then demolished in a controlled collapse, bringing the entire structure down safely. Investigators sifted through the wreckage afterward, recovering several more items: shell casings from the rifle, fragments of cloth. A wristwatch stopped at 3:47. The medical examiner's analysis confirmed the identity through dental records. The body was definitively David Miller. Cause of death was more difficult to determine after so long, but the evidence suggested hypothermia, compounded by likely injury or illness. There was no trauma to the skeleton suggesting violence or a fatal fall. The notebook that David had been clutching was sent to a document restoration specialist. Through painstaking work using specialized imaging technology, they were able to recover portions of what David had written in his final days. The pages were dated, starting October 15, 1957, ending October 19, 1957. 5 days. What they read was heartbreaking. The reconstructed entries from David Miller's notebook told a story of survival, desperation, and ultimately tragedy. October 15, 1957, morning. David had hiked in from the trailhead, heading for his planned hunting area. But about 3 miles in, he spotted a large buck deer moving uphill away from the main trail. He followed, tracking the animal east, deeper into terrain he knew less well. The hunt led him nearly 2 miles off his intended route. The deer eventually eluded him, and David realized he was significantly off course. Rather than backtrack immediately, he decided to climb to higher ground to get his bearings. He saw the fire lookout tower about a quarter-mile away, rising above the trees. He knew the towers had maps and could provide a vantage point to see landmarks. A quick detour to orient himself, then back on course, he climbed the tower. The stairs were in decent, reasonable condition then, having been built 29 years earlier, in 1929. The structure was still maintained, though scheduled to be decommissioned in a few years. At the top, he entered the cabin and found what he needed, a detailed map of the area on the wall. He located his position and confirmed his route back. But as he turned to leave, he stepped wrong. His boot broke through a rotted board in the cabin floor, weakened by nearly 30 decades of exposure to mountain weather. He fell hard, his leg plunging through the hole up to his knee. When he pulled himself free, pain lanced through his ankle, twisted badly, possibly broken. October 15th, evening. David's notebook entry was terse. Bad fall, can't put weight, trying stairs. He had attempted to descend the tower with his injured ankle, but the stairs, which required careful footwork even under good conditions, were impossible to navigate safely. With one leg compromised, halfway down, he nearly fell. The structure swayed. He barely caught himself. He climbed back up. Safer to stay at the top than risk falling 70 feet. October 16th. Fired 3 shots this morning. Hope someone hears. Ankle swelling. Very cold last night. He had heard the searchers. His notebook mentioned voices in the valley and trucks on the road. He tried to signal by firing his rifle, but the sound echoed strangely in the mountains, and the searchers evidently didn't recognize where it came from or attributed it to another hunter. October 17th. Can see them searching. Too far to shout. Rifle almost empty. So cold. This was the entry that made investigators weep. David could see the search party, probably a mile or more away, moving through the forest. He had tried to signal, but the distance was too great. His voice couldn't carry, and he had only a few rounds left in his rifle. October 18th. Ankle black. Can't feel toes. Used last bullets. Nobody coming. Tell Helen I'm sorry. October 19th. The final entry was barely legible, the handwriting shaky. So cold. Love you, Helen. Love you, Tommy. Lisa. So sorry. That was the last thing David Miller ever wrote. The medical examiner's analysis estimated he survived 4 to 5 days after his injury. The cause of death was hypothermia, likely compounded by infection from his ankle injury and dehydration. Temperatures at night in mid-October in the Montana mountains can drop below freezing. David had been dressed for day hunting, not overnight exposure. He had only the 1 canteen of water he'd been carrying and the lunch Helen had packed, which would have lasted perhaps 2 days. Without resupply, dehydration would have set in by day 3 or 4, compounding the effects of his injury in the cold. He had died alone, cold, watching searchers comb the valleys below, unable to make them understand where he was. For 62 years, his body had sat in that tower, 3 miles from where people looked, slowly mummifying in the dry mountain air. On November 1st, 2019, David Miller was finally laid to rest in Cascade Cemetery. His children, Tommy, now 70, and Lisa, 67, were there. His wife Helen had been dead for 5 years,
and rescue protocols in Montana. Fire lookout towers, even abandoned ones, are now checked routinely during missing persons searches. GPS coordinates of all historical structures, even those removed from modern maps, have been compiled into a database for search teams. David Miller's rifle, preserved and restored, is now on display at the Montana Historical Society Museum in Helena, along with his notebook, his wallet, and the photographs from the cabin. The exhibit is titled "The Hunter Who Couldn't Come Home: David Miller's Story." It serves as a sobering reminder of how unforgiving the wilderness can be, even to those who know it best. The fire lookout tower where David died no longer exists, deliberately demolished after his remains were recovered. But the ridge where it stood is now marked on maps as Miller's Ridge, a memorial to the man who spent his final days there, watching searchers look for him in all the wrong places. For 62 years, David Miller had been listed as missing, presumed dead, body never recovered. His family had lived with uncertainty, never knowing what happened, where he was, whether he had suffered. Now, finally, they had answers. Tragic answers, painful answers, but answers nonetheless. The wilderness had kept David Miller hidden for 6 decades, but in the end, just as Helen had always believed, the mountains gave him